Hello and welcome to my show. My name is Rishanka Jones, and today we're tackling a topic that is finally getting the attention it deserves: ADHD in girls. For decades, we've primarily seen ADHD through the lens of hyperactive boys, leaving girls to struggle in silence and often being called sensitive or too emotional. Today, I have with me a true expert in the field, Dr. Alison Pritchard. She's the co director of neuropsychology at the Kennedy Krieger Institute and is also a professor at Johns Hopkins. Welcome, Dr. Allison.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, I'm so excited about this episode, and you're at the forefront of understanding the young brain. So, no better person than you who could talk about this very, very important topic.
Well, I love talking about ADHD, so I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. All right, so let's jump right in. People assume that ADHD is hyperactive boys jumping around in a classroom. That's the first impression of ADHD. Can you, in very simple terms, explain the difference between attentive and inattentive ADHD and how it plays out in boys versus girls?
Sure. So that is absolutely a very common misconception that we hear, and it's partly driven by the fact that it used to be called just sort of attention deficit disorder, and there wasn't really this distinction that we now use for what we call attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You're right. Many people think about the little boy who's running around bouncing off the walls. And there are kids for whom ADHD looks that way. But there are also a lot of kids who don't have as much hyperactivity and who really struggle with paying attention, but it can be hard for people to notice that. The kids who are quietly inattentive, who are daydreaming during class, who are working slowly, are equally, if not more, impaired, but it's much less noticeable. One of the really interesting things I think about ADHD is that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, so it's something that starts when you're young, but it changes over time for many people. So even among those young children who start out with a lot of hyperactivity, the developmental trajectory, so the general trend of what their symptoms look like as they get older, is for that hyperactivity to kind of taper off, and then for the inattention to be a bigger part of what's problematic for them. We do see girls are more likely to show the inattentive presentation of ADHD. So when we make a diagnosis of ADHD, there are three different subcategories that we might diagnose. One is ADHD predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation. These are the kids you started out talking about, right? And they're very
obviously
obvious, right?
Yeah.
Those are kids who show 6 out of a total of 9 possible symptoms of ADHD, of hyperactivity and impulsivity. And it isn't just the hyperactivity, it can really be the impulsivity, because these are kids who are it comes out their mouth as soon as it's in their mind, right? They're saying things without thinking, and that often gets them in trouble. They're doing things without thinking. So I've seen kids who jumped off a roof because they were playing with their friends and they thought maybe it looked like fun and didn't think about the potential consequences. For the inattentive, the predominantly inattentive presentation, there you're looking for symptoms like symptoms related to distractibility, having trouble sustaining attention over time, having trouble following instructions, and forgetfulness, losing things, more organization. A lot of what we think of as kind of executive functions are more impaired in the kids with the predominantly inattentive presentation. And to make that diagnosis, again, you need 6 out of a total of 9 symptoms of inattention. And then the last kind of subcategory is the combined presentation. Probably obvious what that looks like. These are kids who have at least 6 out of 9 symptoms of inattention, and at least 6 out of 9 hyperactive and impulsive symptoms. And those kids tend to be the most impaired.
Right. Okay, so now you explained to us the difference between attentive and inattentive. I thought that was like really helpful. I feel that girls use their social intelligence to kind of mask their ADHD. And they're often just told that you're too shy or you're too sensitive or you're too emotional. What is going on in the girl's brain right now?
Great question. And so girls' brains are wired differently than boys' brains, in some ways. And we do have some evidence to suggest from neuroimaging studies that the brains of kids with ADHD may look a little bit different than the brains of kids who don't have ADHD, and may develop at a slightly different rate than the brains of kids who don't have ADHD. But I think when we think about sort of why do girls often present differently than boys, there are probably a couple of explanations for that. One is, because of the way their brains are, because of their genes, because of the hormones that they have more or less of, less preponderance towards hyperactivity. But we also know that, and this area of study, girls and women with ADHD, has really exploded over the last 5 to 10 years. We also do know that girls tend to be more sort of relationally oriented. So maintaining those relationships, whether it's with parents and teachers or with peers, is really a driver of their behavior sometimes. And so they may work really hard to kind of suppress behavior that has gotten them in trouble in the past in relationships in order to try to avoid that.
Because I see a lot of little girls being misdiagnosed with anxiety and depression when they actually have ADHD, because they're doing such a fantastic job masking all those symptoms. What is the long-term effect of this masking in terms of building relationships, or even in school? From what I've heard is that they do well in elementary school, but by the time they reach middle school and high school, you start seeing them taper down, their grades go down, and you start seeing the symptoms come out a little bit.
So, and this is actually an issue, you've touched on a couple of different important things here, and this is actually an issue for both boys and girls. The kids who have the more hyperactive and impulsive symptoms, regardless of whether it's a boy or a girl, are diagnosed earlier on and then begin treatment. For many children who are well behaved but have the inattentive symptoms, they aren't identified early on because people aren't noticing these behaviors as problematic, especially if they're bright kids who can kind of get by even though they're missing some of the information. They may not get diagnosed until middle school, high school, even college or graduate school or adulthood in some cases, right? And I think what we know about the sort of long-term impact of living with ADHD without being diagnosed and then living with ADHD without being treated, these are two slightly different things. I think kids who grow up with ADHD that isn't diagnosed, but who receive still a lot of maybe negative feedback inadvertently from parents and teachers. Why can't you remember anything? Why are you always the last one to get your shoes on when we're trying to leave the house? And I have to tell you 3 times, go get your shoes on. Or the internal frustration, certainly as kids get older, there's plenty of peer comparison that they do all on their own. So not being diagnosed and experiencing those symptoms and the fallout from those symptoms can have a really significant impact on kids' mood, anxiety, self-esteem. Exactly. You mentioned anxiety and depression earlier. In some cases, ADHD may be misdiagnosed as anxiety or depression, but in some cases, it may be happening at the same time. And in still other cases, it may be that the stress of living with this diagnosis and not knowing what's going on, just thinking, well, I must be a dumb kid, I must not be as smart as my brother, or I get in trouble all the time, I'm a bad kid. Really living with that stress for a long period of time really can contribute to symptoms of anxiety and depression. The other issue, though, is with treatment. And we do know there's quite a large research literature that suggests that kids who have ADHD who receive treatment do better in almost every way, right? They do better academically, so less high school dropout, better grades, better post-secondary education outcomes, more career success, less unemployment. They're safer. They're less likely to get into drugs and alcohol, less likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system, less likely to have car crashes if they're driving. And they do better socially, typically, have more robust friendships. So we know that treatment for ADHD can be a really protective factor.
You've explained this so well, but I want to go back to the basics now. Is this a genetic condition? What is causing ADHD? Some papers say that it could be the mothers had a lot of painkillers during pregnancy. So what is the cause for ADHD?
Well, it's a great question. It's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that my answer is not going to satisfy you because I think that there is not a single cause of ADHD, right? So it's what we call a multifactorial condition, right? There are kind of lots of paths to get to the same endpoint. There absolutely is a genetic component to ADHD. So we know that if you have a parent with ADHD, you are much more likely to end up having ADHD yourself. But it's not a one-to-one relationship. So there are plenty of kids who have a parent with ADHD who do not have ADHD and vice versa, right? But we do know that there's a genetic component to it. We also know that there are things that there's been a lot of focus over the years in the research on prenatal factors that might pose risk for developing ADHD. Did mom take Tylenol during pregnancy? Did she use alcohol or drugs? Was she stressed? Did she experience traumatic events, etc.? And I think the bottom line from all of that research is that
We just don't know.
well, there are a few things that we know will give you symptoms like ADHD. So if mom drinks a lot of alcohol during pregnancy pretty consistently throughout, that's going to give you might end up with something called fetal alcohol syndrome. But even if you don't, you might still have more difficulty with attention. We know that exposure to lead paint, even at not astronomical doses, can give problems with attention. So there are some things that we know, families can do to kind of reduce the risk, but there's an awful lot of it that just isn't explained at this point. And that's in part because ADHD is pretty variable. It looks fairly different from one kid to the next, right? And so even obviously a kid who has major hyperactive and impulsive symptoms is going to look pretty different from a kid with major inattentive symptoms. But even within that inattentive group, right, you may have some kids in that inattentive group who are very sort of slow paced. They're always the last one out of the house. They're always the last one out of the car to go back into the house. You're talking to them and they require just some extra think time before they respond, right? And you may have other kids with inattentive ADHD who can respond quite quickly, but might miss the question the first 3 times you say it because they're sort of off in their own world thinking about something else. There are some kids with ADHD who have a lot of difficulty with organization or time management or motivation, and others who don't struggle as much in those areas. That's also part of the reason why it's really difficult to identify one single thing that kind of causes this complex phenomenon.
You mentioned executive function earlier, and so for example, under executive function, I would put organization, starting your homework, or just responding to teachers in class and doing your work on time. Do you have any coping mechanisms for children? Now I'm trying to get into some solutions for parents who are listening to this, who are struggling with the executive function bit, because there's so much forgetfulness, organization, life.
Yes. So part of what's really tricky is that, like we just talked about, kids who have ADHD are more likely to have a parent who has ADHD. So sometimes it's really hard for the parents to structure things in a way that's going to make it easier for the kid, right? So you have to be a little bit cognizant of that. One of the things that I often recommend to families where both the parents and the child have ADHD and they're really struggling with these executive functions, one of the things that I often recommend for them is coaching, having a third party come in and help the child with the organization, with the planning, with the time management, the things that maybe the parents aren't great at themselves, right? Getting somebody else to come in and help with that. There are plenty of parents who are well equipped to be able to help their child with ADHD with some of those organizational and time management skills. And how that's going to look is going to be a little bit different for younger kids versus older kids. Because with younger kids, the expectations are lower for independent use of those skills, right? And so you're likely as a parent to be able to get a lot more buy-in from school around having regular check-ins, reminding the child to turn in their completed homework, things like that. With a middle schooler, sometimes it's harder to get the teacher to buy into the idea that you want them to help the child remember to turn in their homework. Because by middle school, most teachers are thinking, no, this is
I know it.
on you, right?
Yeah.
So I think that for young kids and for older kids with executive function difficulties, number one, I think, is really setting up good routines. That is so helpful for kids who maybe aren't particularly inclined to do it on their own, but who really need that structure in order to learn and remember everything that they need to be doing. So having a good morning routine that maybe involves checking your backpack and having a little checklist on the wall for, okay, do you have your English book? Do you have your math book? Right? Checking those things.
Your shoes on.
Do you have your shoes on? Exactly. Are you wearing pants?
Yeah.
So having some really good structure in place at home and having good communication with the school and structure in place at school too can make a huge difference for a young child with ADHD.
You mentioned school and then middle school. What I've noticed is that no matter what area you're living in, it could be a very sought after area with some very good schools or private schools. A lot of the teachers don't even know that there is a type of ADHD called inattentive ADHD. So they look at the child, they'll see, okay, she or he is doing very well in school. I've never seen this kid get into trouble. No, this kid doesn't have inattentive ADHD. Right. In a situation like this, how do you kind of convince the teacher? I know getting a medical diagnosis is one, but if you're not there yet and you're just asking the teacher to, hey, maybe give her a fidgety toy or put her in a corner when she's giving tests, like how do you deal with that conversation with teachers? And
yeah, it's so I think it's really tough for teachers because teachers receive very little training about, as they're getting their teaching degree, about some of these differences in the ways kids learn and behave. And they don't always receive a lot of training in how to manage behavior
Or
either in the
awareness.
classroom, and awareness about these. So it definitely can be an issue. I think that to the degree that parents can set things up to make it easier on the teacher, that can be helpful in convincing the teacher to do some things differently for the child. If the parent can come in and say, I'm asking you to do these 3 things, right? And be very clear about it. And they're relatively minor. Could you please sit her away from other kids who are talking? Because she really has a hard time tuning that out in class. So that can be helpful. I think that probably in those situations, your best bet might be to try to help the teacher understand how this is impacting the child and your family, right? So the child may still be getting decent grades, especially in elementary school. You can sometimes get by, right? But I think if parents come in and can say, we are having knockdown, drag out battles every single night about homework, or she's really working on this homework, she's working so hard, it's taking her 3 hours a night and she's in 2nd grade, right? Or she's been telling me when we lay down to go to sleep at night, she's been telling me that she really feels like she's not as smart as the other kids in the class, and I'm really worried about this. So I think that trying to highlight to the teacher the ways in which it's really impacting the child and even the family as a whole can be useful before you get the diagnosis. And then once you get the diagnosis, I think it's really critical for parents to try to get a formal support plan in place. I see sometimes schools, private schools and public schools, who say, well, we'll provide these accommodations informally. Sure, we can sit her at the front of the classroom. That's fine. We don't need to draft an IEP or a plan for that. Yeah. And that's great. They're trying to be helpful. The problem comes along, I think, then when those kids move to the next grade and the teacher maybe isn't as accommodating, or they switch to a new school and then nobody's got any record of this child has these difficulties and here's what we've done that's really been helpful to them in maintaining their attention. So it's really, really important to get that formal support plan in place that then you can carry with you over the course of the child's education.
Which is a good segue into my next segment, which is about schooling and medication. The questions that keep all parents up at night is medication. Are we doing a disservice by not medicating a child? Or, the critics may say that we are over medicalizing everything and the kids just need more recess and playtime and everything's become too serious these days. What is your opinion on medication? And are there any natural remedies as well that one should look at?
These are great questions, and these are exactly the questions that most of my patients' families ask, right? So a couple of things about medication. We have a lot of medication options for ADHD, more than for a number of other childhood conditions, right? So we're in sort of a nice spot there. What I always tell families in terms of thinking about whether medication is right or necessary for their child is it is a family's decision at the end of the day. I might make a recommendation based on what I see happening in this kid's life. So I may say, if this is a child who is regularly getting sent to the principal's office in school, who is coming home crying every day because they are dreading sitting down for 3 hours to do their homework, whose self-esteem has really taken a nosedive and they're saying things like, I'm so stupid all the time, right? In those cases, I might make a sort of more explicit recommendation to families that I think that this is probably a good time to trial medication for this child, because we know that medication actually works really well for the vast majority of kids with ADHD.
And this is for inattentive as well?
Yep,
Okay.
it's for both. So for children where it's a less straightforward decision, these might be kids who are struggling somewhat, but not terribly. They're still doing okay socially. Academics are hard, but they're getting B's, they're not getting in trouble all the time. For those kids, I usually say to families, this is a decision that you all have to make together, including the child if they're old enough. And here are the things that it's important to think about. It's important to think about how your child is doing academically, how they're doing with their peers, how they're doing emotionally. Are they feeling okay about themselves? And how and whether this is affecting you as a family as a whole, right? And if you can say, we're kind of okay as a family, this isn't really having a huge impact, we feel like it's manageable, my child's getting A's and B's, she has a couple of close friends, if they're satisfied with sort of where that is right now, then maybe they don't want to go to medication. Maybe they want to think about treatment, but different types of treatment that may not involve medication. But for kids who are really struggling, not just academically, but also or instead in some of those other domains of life, it can be really a useful tool. You asked about alternatives to medication. And so the best studied alternative treatment for ADHD to medication is therapy. And there are a couple of different types of therapies depending on the age of the child and the particular type of problems they're having. But therapy can be a little tricky to find, and it can be expensive in some cases.
Like talk therapy, you mean?
Yeah, so there's sort of two primary types of therapy that are evidence-based for kids with ADHD. One is parent behavior management training. It's a terrible name, but this really is geared towards often younger kids with ADHD, but mainly towards kids who are having more disruptive behaviors as a result of their ADHD. And so that treatment is going to really focus on helping parents learn skills to help their child better manage their behaviors. The other type of treatment that's evidence supported at this point is organizational skills training for older children and cognitive behavior therapy for older children with ADHD. Part of it is just teaching organization skills, planning skills, memory-related tricks. But part of it also is getting the buy-in from usually the teenager, because teenagers don't always see a problem, and they don't always want to change what their parents want them to change. Yeah. So incorporated in that type of treatment is a motivational interviewing component to help identify what matters to the child. Why might they want to change some of these things? How could that improve their lives? But aside from those kinds of therapy, there have been a number of kind of alternative treatments that have been investigated with ADHD. Interestingly, I just finished a big review, and we have the best research support for exercise to improve of the alternative treatments, which is great because many kids enjoy some form of sport, right?
Gymnastics or swimming or whatever.
Swimming. It could be martial arts seem to be a really popular one for kids with ADHD. It could be basketball. It doesn't matter. as it turns out. I think there's still some disagreement about like specifically which sports are the best for improving attention. But any sport, even walking and running, is going to help build attentional capacity, and it's going to build it in the short term, right after you do that activity, and then it's going to, over time, help build the capacity in the long term. So exercise is fantastic. We don't have good evidence to support the use of dietary supplements. There's been a lot of research on omega-3s, vitamin D, magnesium, and certainly for most of these, there isn't a downside to taking them other than the expense, right? But we don't see significant improvements in attention when kids are taking these. Acupuncture is kind of in that same boat. We haven't seen huge benefits from that. And unfortunately, so is neurofeedback, which is kind of a frequent question that I get from families. Neurofeedback is sort of training your brain to respond to stimuli. It can be expensive, and unfortunately, it doesn't actually seem to offer generalizable benefits.
Yeah, that's the first time I'm hearing of that. I haven't read about that at all.
Neurofeedback is one thing, and then cognitive training programs. There are a number of cognitive training programs, like CogMed is perhaps the most well-known one. And I think those are really appealing to families because they want to help their children build these skills. They don't want to give them a pill to make it easier for them. They want their kids to learn how to do this for themselves, right? Unfortunately, kids, when they do these CogMed or other cognitive training programs, they get better at the task that they're doing as part of the training program. But it doesn't usually generalize well to every day getting your homework done, sitting in the classroom and listening, and those sorts of things.
That's just so insightful. Thank you so much for that. Coming back to medications, I'm the kind of person who thinks twice even before taking an ibuprofen. I'm not big on medications. So when I think of giving my child medication for ADHD, which is kind of mind altering in some way, right? It is moving things around. I would think twice, like what are the side effects? What are the long-term effects? And I understand you would prescribe that only when you feel it's very, very necessary. So if you could talk a little bit about the side effects, the long-term effects, and how as a parent you can convince yourself that yes, there are side effects, but at the same time, my child's day-to-day is much better than what it would be if they were not medicated.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are sort of 3 classes of medications that are commonly used to treat ADHD. The first is stimulants. Yes. That's a large proportion of the medications that are used to treat ADHD. And we have a lot of different stimulants to choose from at this point. The second class of medications are norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. So that's like Strattera. You've probably heard of it, right?
That would be the non-stimulants, right?
That's a non-stimulant. Okay. And then the third class, which is also a non-stimulant, is they're called alpha agonists. So this is clonidine or guanfacine, some of those. They don't get used as frequently. So usually the first line treatment is a stimulant. And when I talk to families about whether it makes sense for them to try a stimulant, we talk through, and I also want to be clear that I'm a psychologist, so I'm not prescribing the medication, and there are many folks who are much more knowledgeable about medication than I am. Yeah. But I know some basics, right? So when they're thinking about whether to try a stimulant, they want to think about potential side effects. We know that the most common side effects for stimulants are appetite suppression, kids not feeling hungry as much, headaches, and stomach aches, right? Those are kind of the most common side effects. And then there's some evidence that the headaches and the stomach aches, and for some kids, the appetite suppression, may get better over time if they keep taking the medication. But The really fantastic thing about stimulant medication is that it works very quickly and it's out of your system very quickly. So in comparison to like SSRIs, like Prozac or Paxil that might be used to treat depression or anxiety, those are medications that you have to take for a while before you really know if it's working. And then you might have to sort of taper off of it if you're going to discontinue it, or otherwise it's going to, not feel good. With stimulants, they're a very easy medication to trial without committing to. They start working within about 30 minutes for the most part, and then they're out of your system within a day or two. You're going to know relatively quickly if the medication's working for your child and if there are side effects. And if there are side effects, they're not going to last that long, because once your child stops taking the medication, it's out of their system pretty quickly. So I think that is honestly the biggest sort of selling point to help parents feel a little bit more comfortable with the idea of you're not committing your child to a lifetime of medication use. You are trialing something. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but you'll know pretty quickly, right? And then many parents trial it and then have this sort of really eye-opening experience. Kids are able to say, whoa, my life just changed. I'm awake, right? I also talk with families a bit about what medication use looks like long-term. We have had stimulant medications for more than 50 years now, being used regularly, being studied. So they're a class of medication that we know a lot about at this point. And by and large, we really have not identified long-term risks for stimulant use, right? So if you use stimulants over the course of decades, there really aren't major consequences to that in terms of physical health or mental health. We do know that if you're appropriately treated, your outcomes are likely to be better. I always feel like I sound like I'm pushing medication. I'm really not. I don't think it's the right course of action for all kids and all families. But I think that as medication goes, stimulants are a pretty low risk medication to try.
As a parent, yes, I agree with the fact that it's in and out quickly in one day. But some parents are giving it twice a day. Say you're giving the first dose in the morning, then you're giving the second dose in the afternoon, and then by evening, it's out of your system. But then in the evening, your child is chaotic. They're back to being hyperactive or inattentive.
Hard time. Yeah.
In a situation where one day you cannot get access to this medication, whether it's Adderall or whatever, aren't we making our kids so dependent on a medication? I just worry about the downside of it, like in the evenings or afternoons when you're coming off it.
There are definitely some children for whom that coming off of it period of time is tough. And they may experience some meltdowns and some sort of emotional dysregulation that's really unpleasant for them. And those are cases where you would want to work with your physician to not have that happen. In terms of whether we're becoming sort of overly dependent on these things, I think it's in part sort of a bigger cultural issue. I tend to be like really pragmatic in my approach to things. And I'm not saying that's always right, but that's just sort of how my head works. And I think that there are certainly children who have access to school environments, to home environments that are really going to optimize their ability to pay attention. And if you have access to those environments, then you can probably do an awful lot without medication. Unfortunately, majority of kids probably don't have access to those environments. And the way that we as a society do childhood, you are expected to be in school from the age of 5 until you're 18. And school involves sitting in a chair for most of the day listening to a teacher, right? There are many kids who are able to do that just fine. But there are a lot of kids for whom that is hard and who struggle with that. And kids with ADHD tend to struggle with that even more. Now, if we could change their environment to one that is really hands-on and where you're outside learning and doing and touching and smelling, all of the things, I think it would be particularly useful for kids with ADHD. So I think pragmatically, because many kids don't have a lot of options in terms of how much they can change their day-to-day environment, this is sort of the next best thing that we can offer them. And I do think that as they move into adulthood, many children with ADHD self-select into work environments that are a good fit for them, that play to their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. But we got to get them through school.
Yeah. Wow. I have so many questions going on in my mind, but let's talk about school. Do you think, and let's just specifically talk about girls right now, girls who have ADHD, should they be in a mainstream school or a regular classroom setting is fine for them? Because I know, especially in the DMV area, there are many schools that cater to just neurodivergent kids, right? Do you think that kind of puts that stigma on them that, hey, at a very young age, you're ADHD, and then you're going to see all levels of ADHD or autism or whatever in that school? So do you think that kind of schooling is better?
It's a good question. But at first, I want to address this labeling issue because I think that's a major concern for a lot of families, right? Yeah. And there is a lot of stigma around mental health in general, but ADHD in particular. And I'm borrowing this from a colleague of mine because I thought it was really, really well put. Certainly, no one wants their child to experience stigma associated with having a diagnosis of ADHD and being labeled that way. A lot of kids who aren't diagnosed but who have ADHD get labeled as bad kids, right? Problem kids. And I think for many families, that label is even worse than an ADHD label, because I've had this experience working with parents before where we'll go through an evaluation, I'll make the diagnosis of ADHD, explain it to the family, and then the parents are looking at me like, oh my God. They feel terrible because they're like, I have been bugging him and getting mad at him because I have to tell him 3 times to do everything. And then finally I'm yelling at him and you're telling me it's not really his fault, right?
It makes you feel bad as a parent.
It makes you feel bad. And I think that one of the really nice things that a diagnosis of ADHD can do for some kids is for parents and teachers, allow them to recognize that some of this is not really within this child's control. And they're not talking with the kid next to them to be a bad kid. They're not willfully misbehaving. It's really not within their control. Okay, so that's the label issue. Yeah. I don't think there's anything wrong with some of these specialized schools that are geared towards folks with ADHD, disabilities, etc. But I also think that probably the majority of kids with ADHD can be very effectively educated in the public school system with a bit of extra support. And there isn't really research on this that I know of to be able to say kind of one way or the other. But I haven't necessarily seen major benefits to a private school or a specialized school for kids with ADHD specifically. I think that there are maybe some other conditions like dyslexia or reading disorder where there's maybe a bit more of an advantage that folks are getting from some of those schools. But in many cases, the supports and accommodations that kids with ADHD need are not terribly taxing. They're not great big changes to the classroom. They're relatively minor modifications. So many kids with ADHD can be effectively educated as part of the regular public school system.
Okay, that's helpful. Relationships in general, and talking about girls, women, all ages, relationships don't really last long. Friendships or romantic relationships, especially friendships, I've noticed, because a person who has inattentive ADHD would miss phone calls, miss text, forget to respond, not be very good at following up, keeping in touch, people pleasing. Basically, there's no boundaries. You either this way or you're completely trying to please the other person, you know. I know medication to some extent can fix that. What are the best strategies for a girl who misses all these social cues and is just feeling like an outsider in a peer group?
It's really hard. I don't know that there is an easy fix for that. Yeah. Certainly, and this can feel kind of awkward, especially at first, but I think it can become a little more natural with time. Some kids with ADHD need direct instruction and routines around some of these social settings. So some kids with ADHD and some adults with ADHD probably could benefit from it too, is they need sort of rules for how to approach social interactions in some cases, and models for how to do so and practice with it. So for kids with ADHD, often when they have social difficulties, we recommend that they participate in a social skills group that's going to help sort of teach them some specific skills that help you meet new people or engage with potential friends, but then also allow you to practice taking other people's perspective, which can sometimes be a little hard for kids with ADHD. As folks get older, there aren't very many groups like that anymore. It's kind of assumed that you learned that stuff when you were little. Sometimes what might be more useful for an adult with ADHD who's having trouble maintaining friendships for the reasons you suggested is going to see a therapist and working with that therapist to set specific rules for, first, to learn how to identify why those relationships aren't working out, right? Mm-hmm. This person doesn't want to be friends with you anymore because you no-showed them 3 times for dinner, right? I know it was because you forgot or you were 30 minutes late or whatever it is, but that makes people upset and they don't want to be friends with you, right? So first helping them develop understanding of why these relationships aren't working well, and then giving them specific strategies to try to fix those problems. There's work that a therapist can do with an adult with ADHD around time management. If you know you were always 30 minutes late for everything, okay, here are some things that we can build in to get you there on time. If you know you have difficulty responding to text messages reliably, here are some specific strategies that you can use to, get better at that. Right? Mm-hmm. But I do think that it's likely for an adult that it would require working with someone else, a therapist usually, to figure out where things are breaking down in those relationships in order to be able to fix them.
Or from what I'm noticing is just be friends with people who have ADHD. They kind of get you. There's always that forgiveness that I understand that you are going through this.
Yes. Yeah, that's another really good point. One solution is to kind of find your people.
Support group.
Right? Your group of people. I think this is something that we think about often for kids with autism or who are kind of somewhere on the spectrum or who are maybe just sort of quirky kids who don't have a lot of friends in high school. And then they get into their first job or they go to college and they find the other kids who love heavy metal music or the other kids who love Japanese anime or, whatever it is. And they develop lovely friendships. So I do think that's a good point, that kind of finding your people who understand and can empathize a little bit can be a really helpful part of it too.
And do you think it's okay to tell a 6 or a 7-year-old, hey, you have ADHD, but there's nothing wrong with it, but this is the reason why you're behaving like this? Or is this something that the parents should just keep under covers until the child is mature to digest the fact that they are neurodivergent?
If you're able to have the conversation at a developmentally appropriate level, it's a good idea. And that's something that, if you're diagnosed by a psychologist, by a pediatrician, whomever, you as the parent should ask, okay, what should I say to my kid about this, right? Mm-hmm. Because for a 6-year-old, it's likely to look pretty different than it would for a 13-year-old, right? I do think there are ways that you can talk to a 6-year-old about this, or a 5-year-old, that are really helpful, because kids are kind of internalizing a lot that we as their parents don't know about, aren't really aware of. And so, especially if it's a child who is getting in trouble frequently, whether that's because they're acting out or because you have to tell them 5 times to get them to do something, they really may be thinking, oh, I'm a lazy kid, I'm a bad kid, I don't listen. Right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important. Talking to them about the diagnosis can be a really powerful way of
empowering them
and allowing them to understand that it's not that they're a lazy kid, it's not that they're a bad kid, it's not that they don't listen. Their brain works a little bit differently than many other kids' brains in this particular way. And so that makes it harder for them to listen, or that makes it harder for, X, Y, and Z. It doesn't mean they don't have to still try to do it, but we as your parents, we as your teachers are going to try to help you do it, because we know that it's not that you're trying to be bad, right? So I do think that that can be somewhat of a relief for some kids. And then when I've diagnosed older children with ADHD, teenagers, a number of them have been able to articulate, oh my gosh, this is a major relief, right? Because I really thought I was stupid. Mm-hmm. No, you're not.
Wow, this is so insightful. Anything exciting happening in the world of ADHD? I know Kennedy Krieger is doing a lot of research. So do we have some good news for the next generation of girls?
I think so. I think there's a lot of really interesting research. A lot of it is focused on girls and women with ADHD. There's particular interest right now in hormones and how fluctuations in girls and women's hormones can contribute to attention at any given moment, but then also at sort of major times of transition, puberty, pregnancy, menopause, and how that interacts, how some of those big life transitions interact with attention. I think that sort of flew under the radar for a really long time and is finally getting the attention it deserves. I'm personally really interested in sort of the interplay between sleep and ADHD. A lot of kids and adults who have ADHD experience some sleep difficulties, and that might make their ADHD symptoms worse when they're not getting enough sleep. And so I think there are a lot of different folks now who are trying to figure out, okay, why do folks with ADHD have more difficulty sleeping? Is it more trouble falling asleep? Is it more trouble staying asleep? Is it
hyperactivity?
Right? Trouble turning their mind off at night. Those are sort of common things that we hear. And what can we do about it? Are things like melatonin helpful? Is behavior therapy helpful? There's actually quite an overlap between ADHD and restless legs syndrome, which is that feeling when you're trying to fall asleep that your legs just feel itchy and you gotta move them, they just feel restless, and it can really get in the way of falling asleep at night. We know that is pretty easily treated by iron supplementation, and so could that be a way to help some kids with ADHD fall asleep a little bit faster? So I think there are a lot of exciting sort of avenues of research that are happening right now that really are going to open up some nice new treatment options for folks in a few years.
That's amazing. And, just let's hope that we keep finding new and more natural or better ways to treat this. Thank you so much for shedding light on this topic and how, ADHD shows up in unique ways in girls. I really appreciate you joining today.
It's my pleasure. As you can tell, I love to talk about ADHD, so anytime. Thank you.
If you saw yourself in this conversation or your child, please drop in your comments here and let's start building this community. Let's not stigmatize this very special thing, whether it's in your child or yourself. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. The Kennedy Institute is doing a lot of clinical research. So if you want to read about it, I will be putting down their resources in the description section below. Feel free to reach out to Dr. Alison as well if you have any questions. Until then, this is Rishanka Jones signing off.